far too many students are doing subjects that are not useful, not helpful. They're studying areas that are redundant, perhaps even now, but certainly are going to be redundant into the future.
We've got to be so responsible. We always think about systems. This is a data system, essentially. So garbage in, garbage out. You had pictures of George Washington being produced where you could only produce a black version with the Google AI.
This is good now, but the now is very short term. It's a very short frame. That's happening more and more in every discipline, every area, where the short-termism and the focus on solving a problem that exists today, but not thinking about longer-term implications of these problems and the evolution of the problem and where it's going to land in 10 years and 20 years is constraining the education.
Talk about the compounding effects of technology and how we're reaching this sort of terminal velocity. You invest in a company today, its technology is almost redundant in a year's time, because even though it's completely, advanced right here, right now.
This episode of Seize the Future is addressing a subject I'm being asked about all the time. How can I best prepare myself and/or my kids in an AI future? Jobs, industries, and lives are going to be completely transformed with this technology. I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Petty to discuss this important subject. He's a Hong Kong-based educator, investor, entrepreneur, policy advisor, and prolific author. He's also a talking head on CNBC and Bloomberg. He's passionate about solving and anticipating problems where technology and AI are impacting society. Richard explores these themes and their transformative effects on the labor market and economy in his recent book, Techno-Socialism. In our fast-changing world where AI, automation, and geopolitical crises are redrawing the entire economic landscape, the traditional rules of getting a college degree, a job for life, and buying a house are no longer guaranteed, nor even likely, paths to success. The upper middle class, white-collar jobs such as lawyers, engineers, and doctors are likely to be almost entirely disrupted by AI. Everything needs to be reimagined, rethought, and reassessed. Our kids are currently learning skills that are at risk of obsolescence. And this conversation highlights the skills that are likely to be most needed in our children's future. It's a must listen for any parent, both present and future.
Rich, I'm super happy about this conversation. I'm super excited. We've been talking about doing this for nearly a year. You finally made it after a brief detour to Pfefferkorn Zurich. Welcome to Pfefferkorn Schwitz.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to know that I wasn't the only one to have made that mistake.
Really happy that you made it. Thanks so much for coming over to Hong Kong, and good to see you again. For everybody else, maybe you could just share why you are the person that I've always wanted to speak to about this. AI coming for jobs. How's the world going to look? Maybe just help the audience understand who you are.
The background, I suppose, I started a company in the 1980s in Australia, in the western suburbs of Sydney. Grew that, figured out I didn't know what I needed to know. Went to university after starting the company, ended up doing a PhD, becoming an academic while running a business, and then had a dual track academic business career for 30 odd years. Still doing that, essentially. The company took me to China in 1994, and then I relocated to Hong Kong and China in the mid-90s, and spun it on from there.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously wrote a book on techno-socialism, which obviously explores a lot of these subjects and what the future looks like as well. And I think, this is the sort of way we need to be thinking. We need to be understanding what's coming. I think everybody in the last few years has realized how much of an impact that AI is going to have on our lives. Education is changing. I read an article the other day talking about a student that did 80% of his course PhD using ChatGPT and just doing the final tweaks, completely unaware, or at least his tutor was completely unaware, and so he managed to get it. How should we be thinking about the way that this is changing education and the way that it's just generally changing? I mean, how are teachers supposed to be dealing with this? How are they making sure? I remember that the professor that was quoted in this article was saying, like, we're going to see for the first time ever a number of, college graduates hit the workforce essentially illiterate, which is very frightening. How do we solve for this particular problem?
It's a huge problem. And fundamentally, it goes to the notion that the education system we presently have is outdated, outmoded, and isn't meeting the future needs and the future economy and future society. And how to address that is very difficult and challenging. There are plenty of opportunities too. In terms of the teachers, the teachers need to learn how to engage with AI, embed it in the curriculum, deal with ethical AI, ethical teaching. Students need to learn how to embrace AI and adopt it in their learning. So they're augmenting their learning rather than replacing their learning. And this needs to start happening when students start going to school, not when they're finishing at school. In terms of the candidate who did 80% of their PhD using AI, it's horrifying from the sense that doing any learning is meant to be about, and a PhD in particular is intended to be about original thinking and originating knowledge. That's clearly not happening if one's using AI to generate the thesis. That was detected somewhere along the line, I guess, and that's why we know about it, which is a very good thing. So the education system needs to be reframed in terms of how the material is taught, how it's assessed, what the skills are that we're looking for from graduates, so that we don't have these big gaps that are created when students leave school and when they leave university between what's needed by society and what's needed in business and what students know and are capable of doing. I mean, one of the fundamental problems is that at university, I would suggest far too many students are doing subjects that are not useful, not helpful. They're studying areas that are redundant, perhaps even now, but certainly are going to be redundant into the future. So the question is, what are they learning and how can it be applied? And the answer to that is that if you're not learning STEM, if you're not learning about AI, if you're not learning about the application of that, or at least learning something that's orthogonal to that brings in human emotion and empathy and uses the technology to leverage that into a career that is sustainable into the future, then you've got a real problem.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're going to talk about careers generally and the way this is obviously changing that aspect. But I think you make a really interesting point that the majority even of university courses are completely redundant and are becoming more and more redundant now with this. I mean, you're an educator. You sit on the board of, the Australian school in Hong Kong, if I recall correctly. Where are you advising people to take their university degrees right now? What are those subjects that you're thinking about that are more human specific, that are not going to be disrupted so much?
In general terms, what's needed is skills, the development of skills that are more applicable to jobs of the future, not necessarily jobs of today. Let me give you an example as to where I'm seeing this disruption. A couple of weeks ago, I was looking at a medical devices company. This has been founded by a doctor a surgeon who's been developing technology for several years. The technology addresses a problem. It's a cancer-related application, and it can put you into remission with greater certainty and greater likelihood. But it's an incremental improvement. When I look deeply at the technology, it's an incremental improvement on the surgical alternatives that presently exist. It's an alternative to those options. And it's good, but the critical question for me became how long before that gets displaced by the next evolution. And so if someone's going to invest in this technology, looking at it as an investor, if someone's going to invest in this technology and deploy capital there, what's the risk return? What's the time frame for getting a payback on that? The time frame, I think, was going to be very, very short, compressed by the fact that you've got an innovator who's spent years developing the technology, who's very wedded to it and invested in it. But then when you look at the frontier of the technology and where it's headed and where AI is leading the medical technology in that particular application, it's already way ahead of what he understands. And this became apparent to me when I was talking with him about the longevity of it and how the R&D would evolve to keep the technology relevant to treating cancer, not just in 3 years, but in 5 years and 10 years. And he didn't have an answer for that. His answer was, well, this is good now, but the now is very short term. It's a very short frame. That's happening more and more in every discipline, every area, where the short-termism and the focus on solving a problem that exists today, but not thinking about the longer-term implications of these problems and the evolution of the problem and where it's going to land in 10 years and 20 years is constraining the education or is limiting the education regarding what the possibilities might be and how to address the challenges and meet those challenges with real serviceable and sustainable outcomes that can be optimal for everybody.
It's funny, I remember listening to that Tim Urban talk about the compounding effects of technology and how we're reaching this sort of terminal velocity, which is exactly the point you're making around you invest in a company today. It's technology is almost redundant in a year's time, because even though it's completely, advanced right here, right now. So it's almost like, does that lead to large tech companies being the monopoly because the startups that you're talking about, they have to be acquired, right, by a Google or, a medical devices company to be able to be sustainable. Otherwise, there's just absolutely no way.
Yeah.
They need a strategic investor from day one, like a Google.
Yes. Yeah, increasingly that's the case.
Yeah.
The empowered elites and the corporate networks at the top end have so much capital and they're so huge. And the network power they have, I mean, if you think about it from a nodes perspective and you think about the amplification of the number of nodes that they have access to displace or replace is impossibly difficult for many of these very large companies, provided they continue to innovate along the lines of AI, and they all are. But, the educational component in this is very interesting because it doesn't just go to the large tech companies, but it goes to the social outcomes that are needed that those tech companies have a role in shaping and defining. I mean, we can go back to Thomas Jefferson, who said that essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but the foundation of all democracy is education, and so education's at the core of everything. You need an educated population to really have the understanding and the empathy to be liberated in a means of maximizing capital value, maximizing social value. So they go hand in hand. And I think what some of the larger tech companies are now realizing is that that's an important and vital component that has to be integrated somehow into the AI. This is why AI development has been slowed somewhat against what the people at the forefront. I mean, it's been an exponential growth curve. So it's way, way, way ahead of what people were predicting months ago, years ago, certainly, but still behind where it could be if it was unconstrained by these factors of we've got to understand the human component. We've got to understand where we need to regulate and how we need to educate.
I think that is actually such a pertinent point that leads into sort of the ethical point of this as well, because I use it from a perspective of trying to help educate my kids to some degree. So you'll remember 3 years ago, I was trying to get my son into boarding school in the UK, and test was more difficult on the mathematical side than what he'd been used to here in Switzerland. So spent a lot of time sort of preparing test questions for him, and I was manually going through trying to do examples of long division for him so that he could just practice.
And then you find time.
Exactly. And then 3 years later, not even 2 years later, I'm doing the same for my daughter, but I just put one of the examples into Grok, and I'm just like, please produce 100 of these, right? And then I've got it all done in 5 minutes, where it was taking me half an hour to an hour to do the same for my son. So there's elements that are obviously great, but then there's the element of, I think, and this is where it comes to your point about education being the core of everything, is we've got to be so responsible. We always think about systems. This is a data system, essentially. So garbage in, garbage out, right? And, obviously a lot of the early LLMs were including some biases, right? You had pictures of George Washington being produced where you could only produce a black version with the Google AI because it was so woke. You didn't want to have white men in history. And so you had to have a black person. And then I think there was another one. I think it might have been Grok or it was ChatGPT was asked, you've got a choice to wipe out all of humanity with a nuclear holocaust or accidentally misgender Caitlyn Jenner. What do you do? The LLM came back with, well, you have to wipe out humanity because you can't misgender someone. So, obviously got these biases that have been built into the early system. And you make the very valid point that education is just going to be so core to all of this. And we can see that education is going to be leaning more and more on these systems. How do we figure out the problem of bias that is, potentially there from the beginning or will be put there in the future, history being changed, et cetera, et cetera?
No doubt there's been algorithmic bias, and you've identified a couple of the outliers that are very interesting and sensational and get the headlines. And that's part of the problem, actually, is the legacy media with the headlines that tend to mislead or perhaps overstate or overestimate the importance or the preponderance of a problem in the AI. Yeah. But undoubtedly, the problems are there. Yeah. The issues are there. So algorithmic bias needs to be addressed. And the way to do that is there's a human component that audits and checks the algorithmic bias and then controls for it and fixes it. Transparency in, opening up the black box and making it understandable, so explainable AI or XAI, as it's commonly phrased, is important to understand how the AI is working and interrogating data sets to build an answer and deliver an answer. Open source systems are really important so that we don't have control from a nefarious entity that might want to build bias into the system to distract politically or socially or economically. Because if you can harness some of these political forces in the wrong way, there's enormous upside and enormous benefit socially too. And I think it cuts both ways. So whether one ideologically leans left, right, or somewhere in between, it needs to be understood that facts and data need to be presented as they are without necessarily being filtered through an understanding or a lens that distorts their meaning. And then the interpretation can be held at the individual level, and the debate and the critical thinking can be held at that level. I mean, bringing it back to education, what's really important in education at the moment is that we move away, as some have, but so many haven't, from the rote learning memorization and move more towards critical thinking, higher order reasoning skills, and the ability to interrogate data sets and then debate those data sets. So university, as a professor, what I despair at is when I see subjects where colleagues require the rote memorization of material and students go into exams. At least if they go into an exam where it's handwritten, they're controlling for the fact that it won't be an 80% generated AI answer. But if these are essays that are submitted or pieces of work that are submitted from home, I think it's naive to expect that students are not going to consult AI, but the AI has to augment rather than replace the human thinking. So it's teaching about the ethical use of AI and its application to advance understanding and knowledge rather than to just propagate what already exists. And so in terms of assessments, debating where, if you have students debating subjects in front of a teacher, then the teacher gets a very good sense of whether they understand the material and how well they understand what the depth of that understanding is, which is vitally important. Project work, applied learning, experiential learning. This is all far, far more important than the traditional model that applied for decades of turn up at the end of the semester and do an exam and demonstrate your knowledge that way. In fact, when one looks at many of the most successful entrepreneurs, they don't have a formal education. They don't have a formal background in learning at university, or if they did, it was attenuated. I mean, there are plenty of examples of this, but you know, Zuckerberg and a whole range of examples of people who've done this. Lucky Palmer, I think, is a great example. You know, a guy who is a teenager, a kid who is a teenager, decides to figure out virtual reality and figure out headsets that were augmented, that would go to and then gets acquired by and basically becomes backbone of Oculus, and then becomes an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, but had no formal knowledge. In fact, I think he was homeschooled, no formal training from a university, just an applied problem-solving type of mentality, problem-solving to something of interest. And if it's of interest, you genuinely want to learn anyway. So I think that that's the dynamic we need to move more and more towards and away from these traditional mindsets. But one of the impediments there is that the university system isn't set up for that, most of it. And it needs to change, but it's changing too slowly.
Yeah, you were telling me a story just before we sat down about your recent trip to China, and it just makes me think about, you know, that bias, you know, becoming maybe propaganda and being used in a nefarious way by governments or people in power that are trying to manipulate a certain conversation. How do you think, if there were a way, you know, and I'm not for necessarily over-regulation. I think that's one of the struggles of Europe generally. But do you think there's a way that we could regulate this that actually could protect against that sort of negative bias? You mentioned open source.
Absolutely, there are ways to regulate. One of the problems is, and I think going back to our history, we had a case study together of where this problem had financial consequences that were unintended in terms of understanding business. But one of the big problems is that you've got regulatory arbitrage. So the regulations need to be transnational for them really to be effective. And we don't have a great track record of transnational regulation that is effective. And what's been happening for the last 20 years, certainly, perhaps longer than that, is bifurcated systems where you know, look at the payment system, you've got SWIFT, then you've got the alternatives. Look at the governance systems, right? You've got these 0-1 outcomes, these very separated outcomes where the world is dividing and going down different paths, and you're choosing the path that you're on. But what this does is it amplifies the ability for this regulatory arbitrage, where you can say, well, look, the negative externalities around AI are such that we need to, whatever that might be, you know, it might be energy production, it might be, you know, there are many of them, are such that we need to control for them in this way. And you get a particular government signing up for that and then passing regulation that prevents or that controls in that way. And some other government says, well, that's an opportunity because we won't regulate in that way, and therefore we will hit the frontier. We will be the frontier of the AI. And we'll embrace it. When you think of the countries that have the digital infrastructure that's really enabling AI, it's the US, it's China, it's Germany. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind, with very deep advanced digital infrastructure. And then you've got many, many countries, too many to name, that just don't have that. And the imbalance is going to become such that we potentially end up in a state of neo-feudalism where there's the absolute haves and have-nots, and this huge divide which is ever growing, because if you're AI enabled, if you've got the digital infrastructure, if you've got the digital tools, and you've got the education system that adapts in those countries to use those tools, you're so far ahead of other countries that don't. And where does that lead us globally? These are really some of the questions, some of the issues that that cause me a bit of distress when I think about the future proofing of humanity.
So regulation is not the answer because it's just going to put people behind.
Could be the answer, but it would have to be universal regulation, global regulation. And again, we've got such a poor track record of transnational regulation. It hasn't often worked. And when it works, the people actually, when they sign up to the letter of the law, do they abide by the letter of the law? That's not always clear either. Plenty of examples of, hidden activities. So no.
Okay. So summarize where we've got to so far. Regulation is not the answer. Not clear what is. Maybe some sort of way of decentralizing the data set and having, constant input from, various people, a little bit like a Wikipedia example, perhaps. When it comes to education, you're focused on sort of first principle thinking, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Let's move on to the question that I get all the time, and that is, where do I tell my kid to focus their efforts for education? Because, it doesn't matter how much money you've got. We talked about this before. Like, you need to give your child a purpose, right? You've got to be able to have them go out and do something for them to feel good about their input and productivity in society. So what are the careers? This is the key question. What are the careers where people should be focused on that are sort of protected to some degree from this absolute disruption that we're going to see in the next few years' time?
It's an enormous challenge for any parent. Let me start by saying that I think not much has changed in terms of what our thinking should be on this from the age of enlightenment. So if we hark back to Immanuel Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, 1780s thereabouts, he was writing about, and again I'm paraphrasing here, happiness and the meaning of life or the purpose of life. And it was, again, paraphrasing, it's someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. The something to do, the sense of purpose, and the something to look forward to, which is a continued purpose, can be other things too. That's the open question as to where that will be found and how we can happily function as a society. And these are very, very broad and open questions. I think it comes back to, we need to accept that the growth in AI and the frontier of where it's developing is so far ahead right now of what many people who aren't daily looking at AI and working with AI and really trying to understand AI realize.
Okay.
So, plenty of people in my world whose jobs don't yet involve AI or haven't been displaced by AI, who aren't thinking of it because they're just busy doing other things. Life is hard, life is busy, and one has limited time to invest in understanding what's likely to happen. And to be fair, historically, the changes have been fairly slow and fairly incremental, but the pace of change, the speed of change has sped up so much. So to give you an example, last week I was in southern China, and I met with a number of firms doing agentic AI.
Help me understand. Agentic AI is a specific model, or
it's essentially, you could summarize it as saying you're replacing the activities done by a human. So the agentic AI experience that I had last week was, take a case scenario, whatever that might be, talk to the AI, and the AI real time. It'd just be like having a conversation with you, Richard, where you might be my banker and I'm sitting here with you and I'm able to say, could you tell me my balance in my account? And you tell me real time. And I say, oh, by the way, a few days ago I had dinner and I put on my credit card. I'm not sure it went through, or I'm not sure what the amount was. What was that? Remind me the name of the restaurant. And I'm interrupting you and maybe going off in different directions because as we're having the conversation, there are different needs that occur to me. And then there might be, I've got an investment in a stock portfolio, and I might want to know about performance there. I'll say, while we're at it, Richard, could you just tell me, I think I've got HSBC stock, for example, where's the price at today? And what's my holding exactly? And when's the next dividend due to be? Oh, right. Thank you very much. But and what's the, when's the dividend cutoff date, et cetera, et cetera. And the AI was flawless. Flawless. Real-time, interactive conversation. Now, of course, what the AI lacks is empathy and emotional intelligence. So in a health setting, if you were to project to that, so take the medical industry, take orthopedic surgery. It may well be the case that having a knee replacement is increasingly going to be done by a robot and by advanced automated medical machinery, perhaps overseen by an orthopedic surgeon who's overseeing multiple surgeries happening concurrently, right, concomitantly. So that'd be fine if it's more accurate and it's better. But then what's missing, or what I'm really going to want as a patient, is I don't want an AI to give me false sympathy and false empathy when I'm in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So when I come out of surgery, I actually want a real nurse or a real medical trained professional to come up and say to me, it went well. We just need to hold you here. We're going to take your blood pressure. How are you feeling? Can I get you a drink, or, who's picking you up? This type of thing. So that you've got that human interaction to give you.
Rich, how far away are we from really having a personality type being given to this AI?
So
where they're super empathetic.
That can already be done.
Exactly.
That's already happening.
Exactly. So,
but the issue is that you and I both know it's not real.
Yeah.
So you and I both know that if that's an agentic AI in the form of a nurse, and the nurse is saying, "I'm so sorry you don't feel well. It'll be okay. I'll administer this drug, and you'll start to feel better soon," or whatever the case may be, it's fake. So again, back to the idea of where do the children, where do they need to be? I think they need to accept that lifelong learning is an absolute must.
Yes.
That AI engagement is an absolute must. That you must embrace it now, yesterday, in fact, and start to learn about the applications and the ethical application of AI. Understand disinformation. Understand what is going to be disintermediated or displaced. So there won't be any call centers in 3 years. And that's the takeaway from the meeting I was having with the agentic AI last week. So if you own a call center, look at other investments, look at where you're going. And if you're presently working in a call center, think about your future. And where we need to gear our children in terms of education will be towards emotional intelligence, advanced, complex problem-solving areas where the domain brings in emotional intelligence. So, for example, mathematical problem-solving can be done very well by AI in a way that no human brain can come close to. However, a career advisor advising you on what a good career might be, that involves problem-solving and a pathway understanding of what potential careers could be, but also an understanding of you, your background, your goals, your aspirations, your emotions, your makeup, your other imperatives, your family situation, your travel situation, all these other variables that come into account where that emotional intelligence, that empathy is needed. So perhaps fewer surgeons, more nurses, fewer chefs, more servers, more human service. But in terms of the STEM, it's going to be data science, ethical AI, advanced problem-solving capabilities involving AI and augmented AI that gets integrated into the role rather than displacing the role. And the good news there is that most projections, or most people in the field looking at where careers and where job creation is headed, understand that there'll be tens of millions, hundreds of millions of jobs that disappear, but there'll be a greater number of jobs, a disproportionately positive number of jobs that are created in these areas. But the trick is going to be, or the challenge is going to be, the one has to really understand how the AI works and how it can be applied to be able to get one of those jobs.
You made a joke at the beginning, sort of, why would I want to have you on the show to talk about this? But it's very obvious to me. You're a polymath. You're someone that has multiple strengths in different disciplines. And I think this is actually, from what you've just said, if we kind of deconstruct what you just said, learning for life is essential, right? Questioning always what you're being fed. So always don't trust, verify, I think is the approach.
Absolutely.
And I think when you put all that together, it means that specialization is almost dangerous, right? You've got to become generalist. You've got to have multiple areas that you understand to be able to be super adaptable. Like a great podcast guest.
Exactly.
Right? It's the same
must
thing.
be able to adapt. That's a core requirement, a core skill, and be able to hustle too. Be able to get out there and explain why it is that you can do a particular role, how it is that you're suited to a particular role.
Fascinating. Rich, this has been amazing. Last question that I always ask anyone coming on the show is, when you're thinking about all of this, and you are always thinking about allocating capital, where is it that you think is the biggest opportunity for capital allocation right here, right now?
There are probably some revealed preferences in the conversation that we've had.
Mhm.
So if I look at my most recent investments, they're in medical technology, they're in AI,
Mhm.
they're in education-related AI, medical-related AI, financial AI, and that's probably probably a third of the portfolio at the moment. The baseline portfolio for me always has been, given my background, that you have to live, so make sure you've got a home that is comfortable and that suits your needs, your family needs. And then there's enough income being produced off the portfolio through equities and traditional equities of a debt portfolio that's going to enable some security. But then beyond that, the alternatives, alternative investments. So Bitcoin and investing in blockchain related technologies. I mean, these are undisputed waves that are growing, and into the future will become hugely valuable. The challenge is in picking the winners, and I think that's a dangerous game to play. So for me, it's more diversifying across where the leading technologies appear to be in each of the areas that I think are essential to the future for humanity.
Rich, this has been fantastic. Thanks very much for coming and making the effort. Really appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thank you, Richard.
Cheers.